So yeah, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today for this CIM Management and Economic Society discussion group session. My name is Jessie Liu Ernstine. I'm a volunteer with MES, and I'm joined today by Alan Franklin and Keith Minty, together who are the co-founders of Global Business Risk Management and based in Vancouver and Toronto, respectively. Today's session is titled What Extractive Industries Need to Know About International Investment That AI Cannot Tell You. That title is certainly pretty provocative, and we can't wait to learn precisely what they mean by it as we proceed. So we appreciate your time and look forward to a substantive discussion. So I won't go through, I won't belabor the abstract for today, as you obviously all logged in having read the abstract, and that's why you're interested in attending today's session. So just a little bit about CIM and MES. For those who may be new to CIM, allow me to take a moment to introduce the organization. The Canadian Institute of Mining, Metallurgy, and Petroleum is Canada's leading not-for-profit technical association for minerals, metals, materials, and energy professionals, with 11 technical societies and over 25 branches nationwide. It's been the trusted voice of the sector since 1898. So one of the technical societies is the Management and Economic Society, which is the CIM body hosting today's session. MES advances education in mineral economics, supports Canadian university programs, and sponsors events across the country where industry professionals share insights on the financial and management dimensions of mining and petroleum. We're pleased to be presenting today under the MES banner. And I just want to move on to thanking our sponsor as well today. Today's session is being sponsored by IM Gold and with silver sponsorship by Global Risk Management. And before we move on, we would like to take a moment to introduce today's speakers. Alan Franklin has spent the past decade developing and teaching international business risk management and due diligence for Athabasca University's Executive MBA program. He has taught international investment courses to diplomats globally through the Diplo Foundation and at the Royal University of Law and Economics in Cambodia. As Managing Director of Global Business Risk Management, Alan brings real-world consulting experience in the extractive industries with a focus on practical risk analysis rarely discussed in mainstream literature. He has advised major institutions, including the African Development Bank, the Asian Development Bank, and ASEAN, as well as foreign affairs departments worldwide, specializing in the corruption challenges investors face and how to navigate them. And he's joined today by Keith Minty, who has more than 40 years of professional operating and senior management experience in mineral resource exploration and development in Canada and internationally. Mr. Minty is a co-founder of Global Business Risk Management. It's founded in 2015 and specializing in international investment consulting group that identifies and develops strategies to mitigate project economic risk in foreign jurisdictions. Keith obtained a Bachelor of Science in Mining Engineering from Queen's University in 1978, and in 2014 received a Master of Business Administration degree from Athabasca University, Alberta. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Alan, who will kick off today's presentation.
Thank you so much. And thanks for the wonderful introduction. I want to welcome everybody here. Just to start off, the title is What AI Can't Tell You. And the reason that is part of the title is that we're going to be looking at a lot of situations where the information is based on what happened to companies over the years. And much of that is not written about, right? Companies know, but they don't publish it or publicize it. So it doesn't get into the AI database. We know about it because we talk to companies around the world and we know these situations. And that's why we thought it's so important to present this on the basis of not what AI can tell you, but what AI cannot tell you. So the first topic I'm going to talk about is international investment agreements. Next slide, please. Next one. Thank you. So I'm going to start off with a case study that it will really open up the discussion. So a Canadian public company called Lupaka Gold was operating in Peru. It was called the Invicta Gold Project. It was seized by indigenous groups in Peru. So the Lupaka was essentially closed out of their own investment. Lupaka sued Peru and they won an award of about $69 million US. Now, the success of Lupaka was due to the existence of the free trade agreement between Canada and Peru. Chapter 8 contains protections for investors, which Peru breached. This was determined through an investor state dispute settlement international arbitration, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. But the idea is if Lupaka Gold had not been protected because of this free trade agreement between Canada and Peru, they would have been out of luck. There's probably nothing they could have done. So to some extent, these international investment agreements can constitute a get out of jail free card in some circumstances. Next slide, please. So what are international investment agreements? We'll talk about that. These are investment agreements that protect investors. They're global and yet crucial to international investment, but only known to a few, surprisingly. So let me just explain or give you some of the examples of what they are. So the first one is a bilateral investment treaty, which we usually use the acronym BIT for that. There are over 3,000 BITs in force globally. Canada is a party to 38 of these. So we say bilateral, it means that there's two countries involved. There's only two countries can be involved. Multilateral investment agreements are where there are more than two countries involved. The Energy Charter Treaty is one of those. It's a treaty with countries that have companies that are engaged in the energy field. Interestingly, Canada is not a party to that one, but I'm just giving that as an example. The next type are the bilateral free trade agreements, or FTAs, that have investment protection. So the first point is not all free trade agreements have investment protections. The Canada-Peru FTA does have them, and that's what Lupaka hung its hat on when it sued Peru for breach of the agreement. And what happened with, just to refer back to them with Lupaka, what happened was the International Tribunal decided that Peru was obligated to protect Lupaka as an international investor against actions such as their indigenous community taking over and kicking out an international investor. Next slide, please. The last one, the multilateral free trade agreements with investment protections. So the ones we know the best, of course, are CUSMA, formerly known as NAFTA. The next, this comprehensive economic and trade agreement with the EU. The acronym for that is CETA. And the last one that we have here is the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Chapter 9 of that provides investment protections to international investors from countries that are parties to that agreement. So we can see that there's a multitude of different types of investment agreements, all of which protect investors against wrongdoing by the host state. Next slide, please. So let's look at the purposes of these investment agreements. So the first is it legally protects the investors from a state which has an IIA with the host state from wrongful actions. What that means is let's choose, for example, the Canada-Peru agreement that we talked about with regarding Lupaka. So a Canadian investor investing in Peru has protection because it's coming from a state which has an IA with the host state. So Canada is our home state, Peru is the host state. So that agreement protects Canadian investors in Peru legally from wrongful actions of that host state. When we say the wrongful actions, it's actions taken contrary to the obligations under these international investment agreements. So some examples of the protections afforded by these international investment agreements, and this is not full, this is just some of the most salient ones. The first is expropriation. So we saw in the Lupaka case, it was sort of an example of the expropriation, because when the indigenous group took it over, Peru did nothing to stop that. So from Lupaka's perspective, the project was expropriated. Now, under international investment agreements, a project can be expropriated provided that it goes through the proper procedure, which is essentially that the investor is paid fair compensation for the loss of the project. So it puts the investor in the good position of receiving all of their money plus expected profits if the state wants to expropriate. The next is license cancellation. In every country, a company must have a license, operating licenses, mining licenses, several different kinds. If the state cancels the license without proper completion of the steps required under the agreement, then the investor can sue. The next is foreign currency restrictions, and this is really important. Many people don't understand it. Let's staying with Lupaka. If Peru had imposed foreign currency restrictions so that the Canadian investor was prohibited from moving its profits from Peru back to Canada or taking out its investment amounts, that's a breach of almost every international investment agreement. So that protects you that you can get your money out of the host country. The next is fair and equitable treatment, which says basically that the state has to treat you fairly. The courts can't, a lot of countries, the courts are controlled by the government. And so the matter goes to court, and the court is told by the government what to do to this, foreign investor. That can't happen under these agreements. Next is full protection and security. Again, that you can look at that in the Lupaka case again. When the indigenous group took over the mining site, full protection security obligation required Peru to protect the Canadian investor. And one of the reasons for the decision against them was they failed to do so. The next is most favored nation status. So that means Peru is not allowed to treat a Canadian investor any worse than an investor from any other country that's investing in Peru. The other one I should mention also is the national treatment. Peru is not allowed to treat a Peruvian company or a Peruvian national in any way preferable to the Canadian investor. So these are all really important protections. Again, they're not. This is not comprehensive. There's more than this in most agreements, but these are some of the salient ones that you should be aware of. Next slide, please. So the second purpose is it provides what we call investor state dispute settlement, ISDS. if the host state breaches the obligations under the international investment agreement. So Lupaka is a perfect example again. Lupaka was able to sue Peru for the breach of the investment agreement because the investment agreement provides that dispute settlement system, allowing the investor to sue the state for breach of the international investment agreement. It's rare for international agreements to allow a claim by non-party to the agreement. So here we see the agreement was between Peru and Canada. Lupaka was not a party to that agreement. They didn't sign it. But these agreements provide protections to investors from the states that are involved in the agreement. So Lupaka, being Canadian, had the right to sue Peru for breach of the agreement. Just to sort of to contrast it, when Canada signs an agreement with most countries, let's say it's a human rights agreement, which is becoming more and more common, a person who's been a victim of a human rights abuse can't sue the state that breached it. They don't have a right. Under these agreements, international investment agreements, the investor who is the victim of wrongdoing by the state can go directly against the state. Canada has no impact. In other words, Canada doesn't have to join in the claim. Lupaka sues, and the case goes on. So I said before that in the previous slide, it protects investors legally. What I mean by that is many people look at it, for example, at a contract between two parties. The contract protects the parties legally. That doesn't mean that one of the parties isn't going to breach its obligations under that contract. But there's remedies for if there's a contract and one party claims a breach by the other, they can take it to court. So with the same thing here with these ISDS claims, if the state party breaches, there's a direct legal right to go after them. What this also does is it provides the investor with political and legal leverage over the host state. By that, we mean the following. Let's, again, staying with Lupaka. When Lupaka claimed that Peru had breached, it now goes to Peru and says, we think you've breached this agreement. If we take this to arbitration, you're looking at paying a lot of money to us unless you can fix the problem now, right? So it gives them legal and political leverage because in many cases, the state will realize that because of this legal avenue of redress that the investor has, that they're going to pay a lot of money when they lose the case. And the legal fees in these situations is huge, right? In the range often of $5 to $10 million just for the legal fees. So the result of this leverage is that the parties often can settle the problem between them. But if there was no international investment agreement, the state would have no political or legal reason to try to settle the dispute with the party. Next slide, please. Now, another example that really brings much of this to the forefront is the Noble Energy case. I don't know if you're familiar with Noble Energy. Is a big Texas energy company which invested in the Leviathan project, which is a big LNG and a gas project in the Mediterranean, just off the shore of Israel. It was an Israeli project. Noble Energy went into it. And they didn't know about international investment agreements. That resulted in huge losses. Let me explain what happened. Their advice from their consultants or advisors was, if you're going to go to Israel and do this project, there's going to be huge profits. You should and set up the corporation in a tax haven in the Caribbean. That way, you'll save taxes. They did. When the problem started, the first problem that started when the project started was that Israel doubled the royalty fees that Noble had to pay on the extraction of the energy. So Noble calls Israel, speaks to Bibi Netanyahu, and says, "You can't do this to us. We're going to take this to arbitration, international arbitration." And Israel, being pretty savvy on these issues, said, "Well, that's really a great idea, pals, but there is no international investment agreement between Israel and the country that you incorporated the company to do business in Israel. So that's not going to happen." Well, that really shocked them when they realized that because they hadn't invested under the protection of international investment agreement, they had no right against Israel. They went and got some further legal advice, and they were told, well, Cyprus has a bilateral investment treaty with Israel. So we'll just go ahead and incorporate in Cyprus. Then we'll have the protection of that agreement. And that's what they did. They called it Netanyahu, told him, okay, now we're ready to do battle with you. Netanyahu said to them, well, you can't incorporate in a jurisdiction to get protection under a different treaty after the problems have arisen. They checked with their lawyers. Yep, that's true. So now they were sitting in a position where Israel had changed the deal on them, and there was nothing really that they could do. The end result was that they sat down and had to renegotiate a new deal in Israel, which was a pale image of what they had originally set up. And when I spoke to the company, they said, Alan, if we had known this before we had started, we would have done it properly, but we had no idea. Not only do we have no idea, but we engaged counsel, and all they did was tell us to set it up in a tax haven, not recognizing that it's great to save tax on huge income. But when there's no income because of the risk of the other side changing the deal and you having no redress, they realized that was bad advice that they had gotten. So that was really one of the, speaking to Noble Energy was really one of the reasons why I've taken this kind of program on the road at Athabasca and a few other schools. And we're talking to CIM and MES about perhaps doing a similar program through them as well, because sophisticated investors are knowledgeable of these issues and can execute a project efficiently. But very few investors actually understand this. Now, all I can give you here is a very short preview of what this is all about, just so that to pique your interest and say, wow, perhaps we need to know more about it. So now I'd like to turn to my colleague, Keith, to talk about a few of these issues. So Keith, do you look at these treaties before you invest in a project with one of your mining companies?
Well, thank you, Alan. Well, I'd like to start off a little bit of my background, if I could, please. Back in 2005, I believe, I started work in Dubai, UAE, working for a private sovereign wealth fund, and which was very wealthy. And they would make investment decisions in the Middle East, North Africa, and Asia, mostly by gut feel, but not taking any of these international investment agreements into hand at all. And basically, since they were very wealthy, if they ran into a problem, they just spend themselves out of that problem. So it was not a these agreements were not a consideration at that time. So I was there for a total of 12 years. And however, during my tenure there, I completed an MBA program I took the MBA program at Athabasca University and took this international investment course from Allen. I believe it was in 2013, I think it was. Anyways, make a long story short, this opened up my eyes and realizing there was another tool in the toolbox that we could use besides gut feel. And you can imagine working in the Middle East and all the character companies countries that we were associated with, especially in the oil and gas and mineral industry, throughout that whole area. And as a result, did we have any failures? Oh, yes, we did. How did we get out of those failures? Usually by spending money. Um, it was not fashionable, I guess, or understandable at the time that indeed these international investment agreements are there for the investor into host countries. So, as a result of my knowledge of learning about international investments and investment agreements, I started practicing and looking at whether countries that we wanted to invest in, these host countries, whether or not they had an agreement with the UAE. And it was quite remarkable. Some of them did and some of them didn't. However, when we included them our risk matrix profile, it was clearly visible to us that if there wasn't a investment international investment agreements with the host country, then we would give a lower rating in our investment risk profile. It was interesting because I was trying to change an organization that was mostly built on trust, as mostly people in the UAE work on trust and gut feel, and trying to inform the CEO and also the chairman that indeed there was other tools that we should consider. And as a result, we did tighten up on our investment criteria and started to use international investment agreements as part of our toolbox analysis. So, and the whole, uh, Alan, yes, I have used it, and it hasn't been successful to me in my dealings of looking at international companies in other host countries once upon leaving the UAE, and the answer is yes. And as a result, there are many instances where we did not proceed with a investment in the host country, mainly because of the lack of suitable protection, and that's risk protection regarding to these investment agreements. Okay, Alan?
There, sorry about that. Just to pick up on that, Keith and I were engaged consulting for a huge corporation, which is probably a household name to all of you in this session. They had had a problem with a host state in Africa. And um, we were shocked when we realized that they had no knowledge whatsoever of international investment agreements. And we explained it to them, and they said, "Oh, okay. Well, we'll try and negotiate a settlement with the host state. If we can't, we'll come back to you guys for some help under this new thing of international investment agreements." We said to them, "That's like trying to settle a contract dispute with the other party without knowing what the contract says." And we were both so shocked because here was a company that had no idea about any of this area. I want to two questions in the chat that I realize I need to address to clarify. Natasha said, in the event of an IAA dispute, in which court is the case argued? The answer is in the court of neither country. This is international arbitration. So the case is heard, it could be at the London Court of International Arbitration or the International, uh, um, uh, sorry, the World Bank has ICSID in Washington. There's about 30 of these organizations globally that are completely independent of any state. So the case goes there, and the judges are independently chosen. So there's no power in either state to influence the judges in the outcome. That's why this is so important. Because if you have to go, let's go back to the Peruvian situation. If Lupaca had to sue in Peru, the Peruvian court, chances are the Peruvian court would say no, just because they know the judges would be worried that if they said yes and issued an award of huge damages against their own state, they would be in trouble themselves as judges. So these are always completely independent international arbitrations, and under the conventions regarding this, these decisions are enforceable almost anywhere in the world. So if Lupaca, and actually just to pick this up with Lupaca, so far they haven't been paid yet. So they're now going to the U.S. to have the award enforced in the U.S. against Peruvian assets in the U.S. So if you don't get satisfaction from the decision, you can go after the assets of that state almost anywhere in the world. And the other question is, if a country has not signed an IAA, can a Canadian mining company sue country A for expropriation? Realistically, you're not going to get far. Theoretically, you can, but you're not. If you sue the state in the courts of that state, it's going to get you absolutely nowhere. That's why this concept is so important and yet so not understood by investors. So I want to move on to the next topic we're looking at is corruption issues. Next slide, please. Thank you. So we all know that demand for bribes are ubiquitous globally. We're all told, and I'm sure all of you have probably been in some session where you've been told, paying a bribe is illegal. If you pay it, you're going to be criminally liable. It's going to hurt the reputation of your corporation. You can't do it. There's a lot of reality to that advice. However, what they don't tell you is refusing to pay a bribe can be very dangerous, and that's not well publicized. The consequences can include prison, death threats, seizure of property by the host state. The larger the investment expenditure, the greater the risk to the investor. What do I mean by that? If you're a mining company, you're just starting to put money into the project and you have a corruption demand, you can easily say no and just walk away. If you've got $500 million invested in the ground in that country, saying no and walking away is not easy, right? So the larger the amount you've got, the harder it is to resist. Next slide, please. So the question is, how do we know that the bribe demands are so ubiquitous after the project has started? And the answer is going back to my previous talk, to the topic of ISDS decisions, investor state. There are at least 40 decisions that we're aware of where the case really stemmed from the state expropriating, canceling licenses, putting people in jail, primarily because the investor refused to pay the bribe demand. This is especially the case when the project reaches commercial production. That's when the state often does it because they've got the investor has the most invested at that point. And so the leverage that the state has over the investor saying, well, if you don't pay, we're going to take it away. This has been confirmed by these international investment arbitrations. So it's independent judges internationally who have said, yes, these cases really stem from that. So the corruption issues are so common. And Keith, I'm sure, has experienced these over the years. Now, a corruption demand is generally a breach of the International Investment Agreement. So the investor is permitted to initiate an ISDS claim against the host state because of the demand for the bribe. But that's not your key tool to deal with bribe. You don't say to the state, well, if you expropriate us because we don't pay the demand, we're going to sue you. That's not the best avenue of approach. Next slide, please. So the first, we're looking at some mitigation tools. So I just said, don't rely on the ISDS claim as your main mitigation tool. The first is risk comprehension. What's happening? What is the risk? What are they going to do if we don't pay? And at the same time, you need to be developing mitigation tools in advance to protect against the corruption investment risk materializing. Most companies don't do this. And when the bribe demand arrives, they act like deer in the headlights and do everything wrong that's possible because they haven't set up a program. They don't have a toolbox to deal with this. So some of the tools that can be included in the toolbox, the first we have is powerful financiers. By that, we mean if you've been financed by the World Bank, for example, the International Finance Corporation, which finances private investors in developing countries. If they've provided equity or debt financing and you run into a problem of corruption demand, they are very powerful internationally. And they're known, and I've talked to a lot of people from the World Bank who've done this. They go into the back room with the country. Let's stay with Peru. And they're going to go into the back room with the government of Peru and say, listen, we understand you're demanding bribes. That's going to destroy the project. We're looking for the project to do well so that we get repaid our principal and interest. If you continue and destroy the project, we have ways of getting even with you, like we won't ever lend to Peru again. So that's one of them. And one of the things we suggest with companies is even if you have the financial power to self-finance, don't do it. Go to one of these financiers. It could be the World Bank or the Inter-American Development Bank in Latin America, or the ASEAN Development Bank in Asia, African Development Bank. They all have this kind of power. It's not guaranteed they're going to use it for you at the time. There's a lot of other factors, but it's sure a good tool in your toolbox. The next one we're looking at is powerful partners. Powerful partners can be another state, right? That's a joint venture partner in your project, because that other state may have a lot of political leverage over the host state that you're investing in. Next, we suggest local partners. Local partners, for one thing, can be local banks. If you're borrowing from a local bank in the host state, the host state may not want to destroy your project, because if they destroy your project, their local bank is going to be a big loser in that deal. So that's one example. Others, you get other companies in the host state that are well known and have good political power within the state to partner with you. That can bring power. The last point here is diplomats. And by diplomats, we're looking at both the diplomats from the host state, so your own from your home state, and the host state. So let me give an example. Let's use the Lupaka again. When Lupaka had a problem, I assume, I don't know, I haven't asked them, they should have gone to the Canadian diplomats in Peru. the Canadian Embassy. Ask them for help. The diplomats often can help. We hear stories where the diplomats or the ambassador says to the Canadian company, go home, have a nice weekend, don't even deal with this. By Tuesday, we will have this problem solved with the host state because we're here and they will listen to us. So the power of diplomats is so underutilized because they're not the first tool that people think of. We can also go to the diplomats in Canada. We go to the trade commissioners in Canada under global affairs, or we can go to the diplomats from Peru in Canada. They all have, Peru has an embassy, it has consulates here. You can talk to them, and they can sometimes put pressure on their own government. So there's so many ways of dealing with these problems. But as I said, the usual situation for a company is they don't do any of this in advance. They wait, and then if a problem happens, it's a little late to start going to our diplomats if you haven't established a relationship with them from the get-go when you were even considering the uh, investment in the first place. So, Keith, what investigations do you do of the corruption regime of a state before engaging? What steps do you take?
Okay, well, I'm going to go back to my days in the UAE, which was very informative to me and where I got to learn a lot about how to deal with corruption issues. Our When we did our desktop study of the host state we're going to deal with, we had a contract with Oxford Analytica, based out of Oxford, England, and they were very knowledgeable, and they can tell us a lot about host countries regarding to the political issues. And then we would do a reconnaissance of the host country just by talking to various individuals, and we would get a feel of the land, get to know who's who in the zoo, as I say, and that was very informative. But one thing you got to remember about corruption: who are the main entities of corruption? And then basically, it's the police, military, then politicians. In the case where I was working out at Dubai, the politicians would go into the emir of the UAE or even Abu Dhabi, and they were looking for some sort of investment into their host country. So therefore, based on that, the emir of Abu Dhabi or from UAE would contact the chairman of our company, and we would get to have a meeting, generally a high-level meeting with either the president or the vice president of the country the host country when he was in visiting UAE. So therefore, we had a pretty good indication just talking to the political operatives at that meeting. However, it's the one thing as mentioned by Alan just right now. If you know who's in the who's who in the zoo and the political, that's very useful. However, it's not for all cases. But as I said, the police and military, the police are very low level. Um, they're they're mostly looking for bribes because they're not paid very well, and you can deal with those issues if you have a proper corruption mitigation strategy, and especially with the company. Where the company I was with, we developed a strategy on how to deal with corruption and worked fairly well. Each country is different, and especially every company is different, and each host country is different. However, the police can be dealt in one way. The military is a different kettle of fish, and especially in a host country where the military is not paid very well. And There and the main issues associated with the military is that, and it's unbelievable, the military will actually sell its bullets to the opposition in order to get food. So therefore, it gives you a really consternation on how to deal with people like that, especially groups. But the one thing is that, yes, did we get any shakedowns? Yes, we did. However, we knew who to contact, especially with our political knowledge of who's who in the zoo. And then we dealt with the political operatives, especially in the president's office. And we were able to eliminate and mitigate most of these issues that are affected by corruption. Now, how do you deal with that if if you don't have access to the president? Well, you're having to, the best way I found out, especially in countries where we were, host countries we were in, is I would find a, an ex general who was well known, known of the host government, and was knew how the country operated, and based on person, that person would solve a lot of our problems before they even started. And always, depending on which country I was in, I would always look for a good used or a good retired general who wanted to make some money on the side and be politically knowledgeable. That helped a lot. It is certainly an issue. I know of one personal instance where the mine manager of a company in Asia was thrown in jail for 6 months, 6 weeks, while he was interrogated for not paying a bribe. And he was finally released when the Canadian government got involved. But uh, it can be very disconcerting, but you have to have is a proper strategy and how to deal with corruption. I'll turn it back to you,
Thanks.
Alan.
Thanks. Just to pick up on that last point, uh, one of our one of the people who was presenting to our group a few years ago said as follows: knowing how to deal with corruption, it depends a lot upon how big your company is. And he said, we were dealing with corruption. We went to the president of a country that we were dealing with, and he says, and I walked into the president's office and said to him, now here's the deal. You'll promise me no corruption whatsoever. If you don't say that right now, I'm getting on a plane, going back to Toronto, and we're pulling out. The president said, done deal, no problem. This fellow said to the group, now, don't try this at home. The reason I could do that was we represented 70% of the GDP of that country. If we pulled out, they were going down the tube. The president knew that. If we represented 7% or 0.7%, they just would have thrown me in jail, right? So you've got to know what your levers are when you're strategizing your anti-corruption program. I think that was great advice. So thanks, Keith. The last topic, the next slide, please, is due diligence. So the picture here we have is, do you analyze risk or be eaten for breakfast? Sometimes it's some of our students in the mining space tell us, they say, we're cowboys in Canada. We don't analyze risk. We eat it for breakfast. So that's the other way of looking at this. Eat risk for breakfast and hope for the best. But I think we're looking more at due diligence to reduce the risks and put the proper mitigation tools in place. Next slide, please. So the due diligence is a crucial step to the success of the project, yet it's rarely done to sufficient depth to accurately define the actual problems. We see this every single day in our work. So the question is why? Why don't companies do the full due diligence? So the first reason is often hubris. By that we mean the CEO of the company, for example, may have decided that he wants to invest in Mali. He woke up one morning and the dream told him to do it. He doesn't want due diligence done because he doesn't want the due diligence people in his company to tell him he's wrong. That's not a good idea. So that's one of the reasons. Another is hubris, meaning we already have the minister of mining in that country in our pocket. He's working with us, don't worry. Well, that's not such a good solution because that minister of mining may be out of a job very soon, especially if there's an election and the government changes and he becomes a persona non grata within the new government. So a lot of times the companies think they don't need to do due diligence because they can work their way out of it. The second one is very common. The financial, the cost is too high at the initial investment decision stage. In other words, it's going to cost us a huge amount of our budget to do the due diligence properly. We're going to find out about all these risks. Then what are we going to do to mitigate them? Better, we should just ignore the risks for now, save that money. And then when the risks materialize, we will deal with the risks at that time. Well, sometimes that, theoretically that might make sense. But as we deal with corruption, for example, when the risk materializes, if you haven't investigated, done the due diligence, set tools and process, you're going to be wiped out when that happens in many cases. The third reason we see this a lot is lack of knowledge. By that we mean the people doing the due diligence don't know what they're looking for. They're not experienced. And companies do that a lot because the young people who've just obtained their MBA are tasked with this. They don't understand what's the risks are. So they do a very shallow due diligence, and the result is poor management of the project. Next slide, please. A lot of this due diligence issue relates to managing the expectations. So investors without international experience expect that doing business abroad will be the same or better as compared at home. We see this a lot, for example, with Canadian companies who go to Mexico, set up an operation in Mexico, because they see the wages being so much lower. And when they get there, they realize you don't look just at wages, you've got to look at productivity. And they realize the productivity is such that the low wage doesn't compensate for the lower productivity. So they end up moving back to Canada because they realize it's not going to work there. And I've had so many clients who have done that over the years. They also don't realize that the risks abroad are very different. The financial risks are totally different. You've got cultural differences, which play a huge part in how your business is going to operate. Legal differences, we're used to a court that we can go to in Canada that is generally unbiased and will make a decision, a court case based on the law. In most countries, that doesn't happen. The court makes a decision based on who paid the highest bribe to the judge, right? And for us, it's very hard to understand that. One great example of that is China. They always say in China, signing a contract is the next step to the second round of negotiations. In other words, the signing of the contract is not the end, the way we look at it here. Qualified personnel is another important one. Do they have managers that can handle your project? Do they have miners who can, work and operate there? So all of these concepts and issues are their expectation of the uninitiated is that these things will all be better, but it doesn't usually work that way. Next slide, please. The investors' expectations are higher than due diligence results. In other words, they expect as I mentioned, the CEO wakes up and decides Mali's the place to go. We're going to do it. We're going to do a project over there. And he knows because his dream told him what the results are going to be. When they do the due diligence and see that, well, there's a lot of problems that will militate against the success of that project, they don't know what to do because the expectation is not borne out by the due diligence. So sophisticated investors understand investment differences and use their toolbox, the kind of tools that we're talking about, to analyze and mitigate risk, resulting in better outcomes. Which is when we advertised this course, we were saying, why do some companies in the same jurisdiction do great and others do poorly? It's usually the toolbox of the sophistication of the investor. These same investment fundamentals that we're talking about, the toolboxes, are the same for the small and the large investor. They all use these risk mitigation tools to be successful. Next slide, please. So a summary of this expectation is unsophisticated investors do not understand the purpose of due diligence requirements. Sophisticated investors understand the differences and therefore their outcomes are better. Now, unsophisticated investors are encouraged to study the risks and mitigation tools to improve investment outcomes. So we're strongly suggesting that those companies send their people to study all of this. It's a fascinating study. And what you learn, and when you work with the World Bank, it's on some of these, and political risk insurance, all of these tools that exist, it's a fascinating study. And when people who study come back and say, we can't believe we didn't know about this in advance. And my last point here is sophisticated does not equate to large. In other words, we spoke about a company that engaged us for some consulting, a household name. They were unsophisticated because they didn't understand much about this. As Keith said, they sort of were relying on the fact that they have so much money that they could buy themselves out of these problems. Keith, back to you. In the due diligence, how do you conduct due diligence on the state before you invest? What do you do?
Well, that's an excellent question, and I was able to develop a toolbox where I had several consultants working with me to put a due diligence list, what had to be done in order to determine whether the host state was suitable for an investment. And this is totally different than looking at the project. And the main issues that we were looking at is how well does the host state operate? Can we get our money out? Can we deal with the political system? And these are fundamental tools that go in above the due technical due diligence. This is the operating due diligence of the company and the host country. And it and again it goes back to determine who's who in the zoo. And we would do the desktop study, get Oxford Analytica involved, and find out who's who in the zoo. And they would actually have pretty good knowledge and have people on the ground, especially in the countries we were dealing with, all through Africa, Middle East, and also in Asia. So therefore, we were able to get pretty good qualified assessments of what sort of issues we'll get involved in. And how we can mitigate those issues, and especially in our toolbox. Since we were basically a small private sovereign wealth fund, we used a lot of consultants. However, it had core consultants that assisted us, and we were able to develop these core group of consultants that worked with us based on their expertise, and we were able to determine which ones produced the right results for us. So it limited us from having to deal with a problem later on, and as you said, solve a problem by spending money. It so therefore, based on a detailed due diligence of the host country was very important, and it's just as important as doing the due diligence of the project that the company is interested in investing in, and especially I put it equate the host country is just as important. Host country due diligence is just as important as doing the ore reserves or ore resources due diligence, and that never failed me.
Thanks, Keith. Just a comment on the consultants. Often we see consultants who give a very rosy picture. And the reason they're doing that is because they want you to invest in that country because then they'll be hired as the consultants for the entire project. So it's really important that you look at whether the consultant is going to give you, blue sky, even if it's not true, right? That's hard to sort out, but I've seen it happen so often. I'm just looking at the posting that was done about as a former ambassador. I wish all of our companies would have this presentation before diversifying abroad. That is the point, I think, the takeaway about all of for this whole course or this whole seminar today. So I think we've used up our time for presentations. We'd like to open the floor to questions for those who have questions on this.
Well, thank you very much for the presentation. Yeah, I actually think two key takeaways for myself. One was, yeah, how are people kind of motivated, right? To your point, Alan, earlier about consultants perhaps want to give you a rosy picture because then they can assure continued engagement throughout your, investment in that country. And another example would be, deal teams within mining companies. Perhaps their, compensation is tied to success of deals, number of deals, and value of deals, and not in pointing out, perhaps that deal won't pay off. And then my second takeaway was based on Keith talking about, the used general that he was gonna find in a country. Seems like relationship is a real, important asset to have when you enter a new jurisdiction. So we'll just move over to some of the questions that people have posed. So Juan, I see that you raised your hand, but do you mind just typing your question into the chat box? Because I'm not sure I have the ability to unmute you. And in the meantime, I'll read out some of the other questions in the chat. Rob Stevens is asking, we talk about due diligence prior to investment. How should organizations look at ongoing due diligence while operating in the country to remain thoroughly informed and continuing to adjust the strategy?
I think that's for Keith, operations. What do you think, Keith?
Well, the one thing you can't confuse due diligence with ongoing management. Due diligence is to determine whether or not you're going to enter in the host country or are prepared to do the investment. When you're in the host country, it's so very important to have all avenues, especially to the right people, and especially to the right or the right corner office where the president is, and find out and to have meetings with them. That helps so much. I've sat in many meetings throughout the world talking to presidents of the country and or their subordinates, and that has solved a lot of our problems. And besides, they besides giving us the treatment that they really, really like us, they actually did like us. So they appreciate all the work that we did, all our socioeconomic um, interests, and so there has to be a two-way street here regarding to your association. It can't be just one way. So that's very important, and that's the biggest takeaway is a two-way street, and just understand what makes these guys tick. They're all politicians. We know they're politicians, but then you have to understand what the issues that they have. Also, very important is what was brought up by Jenny, sorry, Jenny or
Oh,
Jesse,
Jesse.
Jesse,
Yeah.
the finding a retired general is very useful, extremely useful. So,
And we're
anyways,
thankful, and we're thankful to Syria for just posting some articles about hiring generals in the U.S. to get things done. Picking up on Keith's point, one further matter on this due diligence when the investment is ongoing is we were consulted by a group that invested in India because India had changed a lot of rules about 2 or 3 years ago regarding foreign investment and various things. And they didn't know, the companies didn't know that these changes were coming down the pike. And I said, well, weren't you monitoring what was going on in Parliament? They said, well, we couldn't because it was all in Hindi. And we just looked at him and said, so you're operating in a country and you have nobody in your organization who speaks the local languages in order to monitor what's going on? What is the matter with you? That's the first, any company's going to have that in their toolbox while they're there to monitor the politics. So it's not just due diligence, but, having trying to decide how you're going to keep tabs on what's happening in the country as you're operating there. Next
So
question, please.
yeah, so I suppose that's where maybe AI could also be helpful in, just sourcing massive amounts of information out there and kind of maybe generating a heat map or something like that. Um, and then so, just as a bridge to AI, Carlos is asking if AI can analyze thousands of investment treaties and disputes, what critical realities of extractive industry investment still requires human judgment?
Well, the first thing I would say, the first thing is AI can tell you what the agreements say, right? They can analyze that. What they can't do is analyze how is the host state going to comply with its obligations? Does it? That's not within the AI toolbox yet. That's individuals who've had experiences can tell us what happened, but that really doesn't get into the AI, um, uh, you know, internet scraping that they can do, which is why the human factor is going to be so important all of the time. I think that's really an important element.
Yeah, so speaking of human factor, Eden Oliver is asking, do you find benefit in engaging local counsel in order to determine the lay of the land and identify risks and mitigation strategies, including and beyond legal?
So usually you have to employ local counsel to find out about local laws. But, and here's the big caveat here, local counsel wants your work. So they might give you a very favorable report on the laws and what you need to do that doesn't get borne out when it comes to experience, right? When you start doing the work, turns out it's not that simple. Many companies, for example, in China, were told, they looked at the website and they were told, oh yeah, you should have all of your permits in 3 months. What the local council didn't tell them was, yeah, you'll have it in 3 months as long as you pay the bribes. If you decide not to pay the bribes, you're looking at 3 years. And we've talked to a lot of huge companies who lost billions of dollars because they brought all of their overhead to China ready to go, didn't want to pay the bribe, and they lost fortunes because local counsel didn't tell them the truth. So it's a question of finding local counsel that's, again, trustworthy, just like our consultants. Not an easy job to find those people.
So where it's asking if a country has not signed, such as Canada, has not signed a treaty with a country, then can Canadian mining companies still sue that country for expropriation of the project? Such as that, for
Yeah,
instance,
well,
the China example.
usually they're going to have to sue in the host state, and that's not going to be very useful. They're going to lose for sure. There are ways, we call it treaty shopping. Sort of when I was talking about Noble Energy, they may be able to find another country that has a bilateral investment treaty with the host state. And you might be able to incorporate your corporation, your subsidiary there, and then invest in the host state and use the benefit. You can take the benefits of um, that other state's agreement. It doesn't always work. It's a very complicated matrix, and you really need good legal advice. But that is another solution that people uses to incorporate. So, for example, if Noble Energy had incorporated in Cyprus, they would have been protected rather than in Bahamas or wherever it was that they did it. So there are a number of ways, but you need to really investigate this before you start the process.
So far we've been talking about how to work within the existing framework. So in your view, what reforms are needed in international investment regimes to better manage the extractive sector investments? People are even open to and receptive to reforms.
The problem with the reform is um, it's it's up to the host state. One of the first thing they do is claim we have a sovereign right to kick out an investor, do what we want, right? And there's so much academic support for that perspective. Oh, the investor just has to, weather the storm, and if they lose, too bad. And what we're trying to do actually with people, one of the reasons we do these sessions is to get industry people to understand these issues and then explain to UNCTAD, for example, United Nations Committee on Trade and Development, because they're very influential in this, to say, we need these protections. If you, this host state, want good investors like Canadians coming in, which will improve your country, you need to treat us well, and we need to really understand this. If you want just the fly-by-night investors to come in who are just going to pillage your country, that's what you get when you don't offer these protections. So it's not a question of a revamping of the whole situation. It's really getting on a case by case basis countries to understand that they want good investment for the benefit of the development of their people, not just money coming in, but the corruption is such a big part of it. In other words, we talk to a lot of countries, and especially with the World Bank, they say, look, no matter what, the country wants the bribes. It could be the greatest project ever, but without the bribes, they won't take it. We know because we deal all the time, they say, right? So this is where the reform needs to come from. It's not on the legal side so much as getting states to understand this.
So I think maybe the last comment is just from one who typed in quite a comprehensive comment about human nature and some of the biases, while playing a role in making poor investment decisions. And he's saying from his own experience working as a technical expert within an investment firm, the fast-paced environment encourages quick decision makings, and oftentimes, once you've made that decision, it's very hard to backtrack on it, even in light of new information. And then, especially younger professionals tend to treat AI generated answers as the truth without kind of, diligencing that. So, could you, especially since the title of today's seminar has AI in it, could you speak to that, Alan?
Well, on the AI side, when I'm using AI, and I use it a lot, obviously, but I know the field. So when I get an AI response, I can see very quickly where they're off base. But a person who doesn't have that expertise, like you said, they accept what AI says as the gospel truth. That's the first place we have to look at, because often when we look at AI, right, it says right at the bottom something along the lines of this may not be accurate, you know. And I found when I go back and question the AI response based on my knowledge, the next response that I will get is almost the opposite of what they just said. They'll say, oh, this person knows, right? So you've got to keep with AI, you've got to keep going with it, keep asking more and more questions to see if the answers tally. That's an important element with all of this.
Yeah, I've personally been led astray by AI quite a few times in my personal, vacation planning and such, like asking about, is the restaurant open or whatever on a certain day. And AI just sounds so extremely confident. I think it's their confidence that's very misleading. So anyhow, maybe in light of the time, it's already 4:45 Eastern, and we've kind of, I think we've touched on most of the comments and questions. So yeah, I'll just thank you, Alan and Keith, for a very illuminating session. And thank you again to our sponsors, IM Gold and Global Risk Management.
Thank you very much for having us. And just to reiterate a point I made at the beginning, we're looking with CIM and MES to develop a comprehensive program on this. So watch for further developments.
And also watch for future MES presentations as
Of
well.
course.
We typically host these once a month. Thank you
Yeah.
very much, everyone.
Thank
Okay,
you.
thank you.
Bye-bye.